Good evening. I come to you speaking today from the heart of the San Joaquin Valley, one of the most fertile and productive agricultural regions in the entire country. Now, from this area around me, you couldn't tell that. It's not being farmed at all. This land was historically farmed with water that comes from irrigation canals that draw water out of the delta up north of here, where the San Joaquin and the Sacramento River go into the bay, and they pump it through canals up to the top of the valley and run it back through for irrigation water. Well, after a while, some folks believed that pumping the water out of the delta into those canals was killing too many of these fish called a delta smelt. Those are on the endangered species list, and so quite often now they shut the pumps off and don't pump any water up here, and so the most fertile part of our entire country now looks like this. It's not farmed at all. If you ask me, that's completely ridiculous. It sounds to me like one of the stupidest things ever. But you know what? I'm biased. My family all farms. In fact, I'm farming starting this year. So I have my certain perspective that's biased. And what I want you to think about for a little bit as we undertake this next little piece of our study is you look at some of these primary documents that I asked you to read this week. I want you to think a little bit about perspective. None of us comes and interprets anything with a completely blank slate. When I do my Bible study, I come and approach the biblical text with a certain set of experiences and worldview that I've developed over 41 years. You too, when you approach subjects, topics, you do those from your own frame of reference. You're biased too. I guess if you think about it, everyone's a little bit biased. When we look at history, we look at it with a perspective, a nice way of saying bias. When we look at our contemporary events, we look at them with our own biases. Like I said, a nicer way to say that maybe is perspective. So as you go through and you look at those different primary source documents, first-hand eyewitness accounts that you have of historical events from our colonial period, I want you to think about the biases, the perspectives that those witnesses to history had and how that might affect the information that they gave to you. For instance, if you ask a farmer about this great vast emptiness, the farmer's going to think that that's silly. If you ask the people that run this cotton gin over here, just to my little bit to the east of me, the folks that run that cotton gin think that's ridiculous too. It threatens their livelihood. The farm workers in the closest little town over here, back to our east as well, from their perspective, it's a tragedy. From the perspective of the people who live up around the delta, they believe it's what had to happen. From the Sierra Club, who are the advocates of the delta smelt, they believe that it was very important. And if you ask them about the same series of events that's taken place around here, they're going to give you a very different perspective. That's not to say their view is right, or my view is right, or anyone's view is right, but they come with a different sort of set of assumptions when they look at the facts. So take a look at the documents that I've given you and consider what they actually tell you about, for instance, Native Americans in that time period. When you look at Mary Rowlandson, from a colonial minister's wife's perspective, who was taken as a captive, she can tell you something about colonial period Native Americans in Massachusetts, but it's from a very specific and biased perspective. What other questions are you going to ask of that document? Well, think about the perspectives and biases of the people that created that document, and it will affect what you accept as truth from that document and what you think you should still challenge in terms of asking questions of that document and that witness to history. Perspective is very important when you look at sources, primary sources or secondary sources. I'll give you just a brief snippet of that as well. You're going to need to know this for the research that we do just a couple weeks down the road from now, you should start thinking about the research paper you're going to do. You're going to be required to use at least one primary and at least one secondary source. Your primary sources are people who are eyewitnesses to history. So a written letter from someone who experienced a particular event is a primary source. A newspaper article contemporary to the event that you're considering is a primary source. Secondary sources are interpretations of those primary events. So if I go back and look at a bunch of primary source documents from the U.S.-Mexican War as an example, and then I write a book about Zachary Taylor as a general in the U.S.-Mexican War, my book is a secondary source. It relies on primary sources and some secondary to come to my conclusions, but I wasn't an eyewitness to Zachary Taylor or the Mexican War, therefore mine's a secondary source. Compiled data, such as an encyclopedia article, a Wikipedia article, even your textbook, that's kind of a summarization of a whole bunch of sources. That's a tertiary or a third level source. Primary and secondary are mostly what we're concerned with. Those 4 documents that I had you take a look at, those primary source documents, those are all first-hand accounts, first-hand evidence from history. Think about perspectives as you look at those.